I wanted to welcome everybody to No Limits. It's a speaker series we started several years ago to really get people to hear from others that think outside of normal, outside of the bounds of things. And Noam clearly is one of those people. I'm Patrick Sullivan, CEO and founder of Oceanit. So Oceanit is a mind-to-market company. We develop ideas from fundamental science and we bring them to market to impact humans and society. So that's really what we do. If you're interested in learning more, you can go online at oceanit.com, and there's a book that came out in end of last year called Intellectual Anarchy. And it's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And it's really about how we think and how we do things. You know, Oceanit is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but yet we work all around the world based on the power of these ideas. So to get started, before I go on about all this cool stuff that Noam does, and by the way, we're putting to use some of his linguistic theories as we've been collaborating with him on a human-style AI. I want to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Waddimal. So Jeffrey is our chief philosophy officer at Oceanit, but separate from that, he grew up in Hawaii, got his PhD in linguistics and AI at Cambridge and MIT. And I think he has the distinction of being Noam's last PhD student. And I say that because the PhD exercise is really important, as is higher education. But in this case, what happens is it's like an apprentice. You study with a master, you learn from them, and it's more than just education. So I wanted Jeffrey to kind of introduce Noam and kind of get this started. But I think it's a special relationship, and these are very unique. And so I would encourage people to support PhD education, because transferring these intangible ideas and understanding are really critical for the future. So with that, Jeffrey, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Indeed. Many thanks for that suspiciously handsome introduction. So I first encountered Noam Chomsky most serendipitously, for I was quite literally withdrew the wrong book off the shelf in the spectral light of the misty catacombs of the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford, rather like Bilbo Baggins happening upon the ring of power in the misty mountains. And for I'd found something precious and powerful too. It was a book by one Dr. Noam Chomsky, The Logical Structure of Linguistics, Linguistic Theory. At the time, I was studying the philosophies of language and the philosophy of science. So the title was utterly bewitching, and its contents did not disappoint. It was this labyrinth of complex but crystalline mathematics, formalizing the grammatical rules that are universal to humans, that enable us to use language to create infinitely complex but comprehensible and communicable thoughts. And there was a sentence in the preface that I would adopt as my maxim. It was, quote, pushing a precise but inadequate formulation to an absurd conclusion is an important method of discovery. That is, we must make absurdly bold conjectures beyond all limits, you might say, in order to discover the profoundest truths. And that is very much the ethos of Oceanit. That's what attracted me to Oceanit. And I think perhaps what attracts Noam too. Now it sounds like a truism, but the history of philosophy and science and modern life from government to industry proves it not to be so, because from Socrates to Galileo, these absurd but ultimately revolutionary true theories and their creators have been condemned as corruptive of young minds and heretical to orthodox opinions. So too with Noam's theory, with his idea that humans are genetically pre-programmed with this universal grammar. Well, so I was corrupted, and upon returning to the New World, proceeded to study under and even collaborate with the great wizard. And it has been the highest privilege and pleasure of my life. It sounds sycophantic perhaps, but it is simply a fact that his is a mind for the ages. He is one of the most cited scholars in history, up there literally in the Decalogue, the top 10, with Plato, Shakespeare, the Bible, works of varying literary quality. His work in linguistics and philosophy enkindled what is known as the cognitive revolution in the mid-20th century, from which arose modern cognitive science, computer science, computational neuroscience, linguistics, artificial intelligence, and the philosophy of the mind. He has worked with us, as Pat said, he has worked with us at Oceanit on AI programs to push precise ideas to absurd but successful conclusions and applications in this process that Pat describes as intellectual anarchy. And speaking of anarchy, concurrent with all of the Chomskyan science and logically independent but conceptually related, Noam is renowned and reviled for his anarchism and his political philosophy, which sounds radical, but it's simply the thesis that no system of power, be it a government or a corporation, no system is self-justifying and can seldom justify its impositions of power domestically or abroad when challenged to do so. And Noam has been this challenger, this gallant gadfly, from being one of the first to lead the opposition to the Vietnam War, to criticizing multinational monopolies and propagandistic media, and premonishing all of us on the existential threats of climate change and nuclear war. So for all of this and more, the New York Times wrote, and I'll do I have to quote here? Yeah, the New York Times wrote that, judged in terms of the power, range, novelty, and influence of his thought, Noam Chomsky is arguably the most important intellectual alive today. And the LA Times, Noam Chomsky is indispensable, just as it is impossible to imagine appreciating the dramatic arts without learning Shakespeare, or loving jazz trumpet without an appreciation of Louis Armstrong. It is inconceivable that one might study contemporary political thought without reading Chomsky. And so today, it is my distinct honor and delight to introduce my Gandalf, my teacher, my friend, Professor Noam Chomsky, to deliver the No Limits lecture, Know Thyself, Language, Creative Intelligence, and the State of the Human Experiment. Following the lecture, there'll be a period for questions. So without further ado, Noam Chomsky.
Thank you very much. A good place to start is 2,500 years ago. It's as far back as detailed records go. That's when the priestess at the Delphic oracle issued a pronouncement defining our primary task, know thyself. Well, that's a two-word aphorism, can be interpreted in many ways. Given what we know today and what should be uppermost in our minds, a reasonable way to interpret it, to interpret the oracle, is in collective terms, as urgent advice to try to understand what kind of creature humans are. And we are indeed strange beasts. We're at once the pride of evolutionary history, also the scourge of the earth. It's a challenge to find out how this could be, and it's an imperative to find out in time so that we can fend off the worst and aspire to the best. Humans appeared very recently in evolutionary history, some 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. It's a blink of an eye in evolutionary time. And not surprisingly, there's very limited diversity among us. The slight differences are what matter for life. The commonalities we take for granted. For understanding ourselves, the proper stance is the exact opposite. What is deeply important, most revealing, is what's common to us, distinguishing humans so radically from all other life on Earth. Variation is superficial. That much is true on purely intellectual grounds, but also in its import for human life. It's not news that we're at a unique moment in human history, a moment when decisions have to be made quickly and decisively as to whether human society will persist in any organized form. We're living at a moment of confluence of severe crises, existential ones. All are collective, with no boundaries. We will answer them together or not at all, in which case the worst will happen. I'll return at the end to a few words on that. For good reasons, then, we should interpret the advice of the oracle collectively. What kind of creatures are we? What are the species properties that are common to humans, apart from severe pathology, and are without significant analog in the living world, even among our closest relatives, the higher apes? What are the properties that paleoanthropologists call the human capacity? When we inquire into this question, I think we find two striking properties that satisfy this austere criterion. One is language, the other is thought, at least thought in any form in which we can grasp and study. It's language and thought that enable humans to issue the proclamation of the oracle, to reflect on its meaning, to seek to find answers to the questions it awakens in our minds. And the same is true of the most mundane experiences of ordinary life, all common to humans and in critical ways distinctive to the human species. Well, if inquiry reveals two distinct properties that virtually define the species, the next question is, what relation holds between them? The simplest answer would be the relation of identity. Language is a system for generating thought, and thought is what is generated by language. That, in fact, is the answer that was given at about the same time as the pronouncement of the oracle, in this case given in classical India by a famous Sanskrit scholar, Bhartrhari, one of the founders of the great tradition of Indian grammar and philosophy. In his conception, quoting, language is not the vehicle of meaning or the conveyor of thought, but rather its generative principle. Thought anchors language, language anchors thought. Using language is thinking, and thought vibrates through language. Similar ideas occur through intellectual history. The 16th century Spanish physician-philosopher Juan Huarte set the stage for the first cognitive revolution, which followed shortly after. He emphasized what he called the generative quality of human understanding, unique to humans, the capacity that we constantly exercise in normal life, in using language to construct new thoughts and to interpret those of others. Huarte also identified a still higher form of intelligence that enables some to create work of true intellectual and aesthetic value, while the rest of us, lacking this talent, are at least able to enjoy and appreciate it, sometimes to carry it forward. Another species property that surely derives from the language thought complex. Huarte also insisted on the universality of language structure, on the brain as the material site for cognitive functions, and on the innateness of these functions, along with the generative quality of human understanding. These ideas have been revived without any awareness of the long forgotten history in what was called the cognitive revolution of the 1950s, which was a sharp break from then prevailing structuralist behaviorist doctrines. These ideas had in fact flourished during the 17th century scientific revolution, which laid the basis for modern science. A core part of the revolution was willingness to be puzzled about simple things, ordinarily just taken for granted. So why do rocks fall to the earth while steam rises? Why do we see a certain visual presentation as a triangle rather than the distorted figure that it surely is? They were not satisfied with the occult ideas, as we're called, invoked to account for what happens in the world. They wanted to focus attention on simple phenomena and find explanations for them as a basis for understanding deeper things, very much as children do with their incessant why questions. That's the stance that has always driven understanding forward. Language did not escape their attention. Galileo and his contemporaries expressed their awe and wonder about a truly remarkable fact. With a few symbols, each of us can construct infinitely many thoughts in our minds and can convey to others who have no access to our minds their most innermost workings. For Descartes, the normal creative use of language, employing this capacity, was a foundation for his postulating a second substance, res cogitans, relating language and thought, a substance unique to humans in his metaphysics. Galileo himself regarded the alphabet as what he called the most spectacular of human inventions because it captured this marvel. Galileo's amazement was echoed centuries later by Gottlob Frege, the founder of modern logic and logical philosophy. Frege, quoting his words, found astonishing what language accomplishes. With a few syllables, it expresses a countless number of thoughts, and even for a thought grasped for the first time by a human, it provides a clothing in which it can be recognized by another to whom it is entirely new. Well, the amazement of these great thinkers is entirely warranted, as is their insistence on puzzlement over what seems self-evident. The insight provides what we might call the Galilean challenge. How is this miraculous achievement possible? That challenge seems to me to capture lucidly the major task faced by the inquiry into language and thought, in fact, into the unique nature of the human species, the human capacity. The Galilean challenge initiated a rich tradition of what was called general and rational grammar. General because it sought universal principles underlying human languages. Rational because it sought to go beyond description to explanation. Throughout, language was regarded as closely bound to thought. The common understanding was captured simply in the 19th century linguist William Dwight Whitney's phrase that language is audible thought, though we now recognize that sound does not have that unique status, only one of the forms of externalizing what's happening in our minds. The great humanist Wilhelm von Humboldt, founder of the Modern Research University, he went further. He identified language with thought. He characterized language as a generative activity and pondered the fact that somehow this activity makes infinite use of finite means. It's a basic feature of the Galilean challenge. Well, Humboldt's formulation of the Galilean challenge brings to light a serious gap in the tradition. It failed to accommodate Aristotle's crucial distinction between possession of knowledge and use of knowledge, in contemporary terms, competence and performance. The tradition kept entirely to use of knowledge, more specifically, use of knowledge in production of speech. Essentially nothing was said about perception of language, which is the prime concern of modern psycholinguistics. Both perception and production access the knowledge that is internally possessed. Well, appropriate means were not available to formulate clearly and to investigate the fundamental task to unearth the system of knowledge possessed, the internal language. It's called I language in modern usage. This gap was overcome by the modern theory of computation, created by Alan Turing, other great mid-20th century mathematicians. It was then at once adopted in the modern reshaping of this tradition. These tools made it possible to resurrect Aristotle's forgotten distinction between possession and use of knowledge, and they made it possible to launch serious study of possession of knowledge, really for the first time. They also made it clear how a finite mechanism can have infinite output. That does not entirely resolve Humboldt's puzzle about production, but it makes it possible to carve out the domain of feasible inquiry, the study of the generation of the knowledge possessed, which has finite means, but infinite scope. In contrast, production of language, like other creative action, is beyond reach of inquiry in any fundamental sense, as is even true of simple voluntary action. The distinction between generation and production of knowledge is fundamental, and it's commonly misunderstood. Generation lays out the terrain. Here are the linguistically formulated thoughts. Production is an activity that makes use of these thoughts, commonly in innovative, creative ways that are not understood. In Cartesian terms, our use of language is appropriate to circumstances, but not caused by them. We are incited and inclined to speak in certain ways, but not compelled. And Huerte's higher form of creativity is still more mysterious. Well, these new tools of computation, the theory of computation, made it possible for the first time to develop explanatory theories of language that yield an infinite array of hierarchically structured expressions that constitute thought and can be externalized in some sensory motor medium, usually sound. That's what we call the basic property of language. Well, as soon as this enterprise was undertaken, serious problems arose. The reigning structuralist behaviorist consensus had no real puzzles. Everything essential was known. Procedures of analysis were available that could be applied to any collection of materials. But as soon as the search for explanation began, it turned out that almost nothing was known. Virtually every sentence poses new puzzles. Furthermore, the elements that were postulated in the best theories could not possibly be found by any schedule of procedures, just as in any other branch of science. As Jeffrey has estimated, emphasized in his work, the driving force in inquiry is conjecture. There's no algorithm for that. What's needed is Patrick's intellectual anarchy, willingness to challenge established doctrine with better ideas. Explanation in the language case has to proceed at two levels. A generative grammar of a language is a theory that seeks to explain its properties, that is, the knowledge possessed by the language user. At a deeper level, the theory of the shared language faculty is concerned with the innate factors that make language acquisition possible. These are factors that distinguish humans from all other organisms. Modern terms, this is called universal grammar, UG. It's adapting a traditional term to a new framework. Well, when you think about UG, it has goals that appear contradictory. It must meet at least three conditions. First of all, it must be rich enough to overcome what's called the problem of poverty of stimulus, the fact that what is acquired demonstrably lies far beyond the evidence available. Secondly, UG must be simple enough to have evolved under the conditions of human evolution. Third, UG must be the same for all possible languages, given the fact that there is no biological adaptation to specific languages. Any infant can learn any language with equal facility. Well, we achieve a genuine explanation of some linguistic phenomenon only if it keeps to mechanisms that satisfy the joint conditions of learnability, evolvability, and universality, which appear to be at odds. The course of theoretical inquiry has been driven over the years by the goal of reconciling these conflicting requirements. These problems were evident at the outset of the so-called generative enterprise, and we now know that they are considerably more severe than what was then envisioned. With regard to evolvability, genetic studies have shown that humans began to separate not long after their appearance. There are no known differences in language faculty, which therefore must already have been in place. Furthermore, there's no evidence, no meaningful evidence of symbolic behavior prior to emergence of Homo sapiens. These facts suggest that language emerged pretty much along with modern humans. And if so, we would expect that the basic structure of language should be quite simple, the result of some relatively small rewiring of the brain that took place once and has not changed in the brief period since. So the apparent contradiction with learnability becomes much sharper. Meanwhile, research on language acquisition has extended the dilemma further. It has shown that a child of 2 or 3 years of age has largely mastered basic properties of its language. Can't exhibit them, but you can tell by experiment that it's mastered them. This includes some quite remarkable properties. Furthermore, statistical study of the data actually available to a child shows that relevant evidence is very sparse. These discoveries seem to require that UG be very rich in order to overcome the enormous gap between data available and knowledge attained. While the evolvability condition demands that UG be very restricted, and the problem of apparently endless variation lurks in the background. Well, in the past few years, some hope has emerged to resolve this tangle of dilemmas within what's been called the minimalist program. That we can see how, by looking at a fundamental and quite puzzling universal property of language called structure dependence. So just consider the properties of this very simple sentence, properties mastered by 2-year-old children, as experiment has shown. Consider the sentence, the boy and the girl are in the room. Why not? The boy and the girl is in the room. That actually raises puzzles. To determine agreement, the child does not use the simplest computational rule, adjacency, which would give is, not are. Instead, the child reflexively relies on something it never hears, the structure that its mind creates. The child then assigns plurality by virtue of the nature of this abstract mind-created structure. Problem quickly extends. So take the 2 sentences. The bombing of the cities was a crime. The bombings of the city were crimes. To decide whether to use was or were, we ignore linear adjacency, and we attend only to the structure, the noun phrase subject. But we have to go beyond that to find the central element of the noun phrase, the word bombing or bombings, which is the more remote noun from the copula that agrees with it. Turns out to be quite a non-trivial computation, far more complex than simply looking at linear adjacency, which is reflexively ignored. Well, let's take it a step further. Consider the sentence. The mechanic who fixed the car carefully packed his tools. It's ambiguous. Could be fixed the car carefully or carefully packed his tools. Now put the adverb carefully in front. Carefully, the mechanic who fixed the car packed his tools. Now it's unambiguous. It means he carefully packed his tools, not he carefully fixed the car. Well, the adverb carefully seeks a verb, but it cannot use the simplest computation. Pick the linearly closest verb, easy computation. UG forces us to ignore that simple computation, construct an abstract structure, and select the more remote verb, which happens to be the structurally closest verb, as we see when we assign the structure in what our mind tells us is the correct way. Well, it goes without saying that none of this can possibly be learned. Actually, there's supporting neurolinguistic evidence. Experimental work shows that if subjects are presented with invented languages modeled on actual ones, the language areas of the brain react normally. But if the invented languages use simple computational rules involving linear order, the language areas are not activated. There's diffuse activity in the brain, indicating that it's being treated as a puzzle, not activating the language areas. So we therefore have a real puzzle. The infant ignores 100% of what it hears, linear order, and it attends only to what it never hears and what its mind constructs. Furthermore, this is true for all constructions in all languages. Well, the only possible answer is that the linear order that constitutes everything we hear is simply not available to the child who's acquiring a system that constructs thoughts. So why then does speech require linearization? Reason's obvious. The articulatory system can't produce structures. So the externalization process must impose linear order on an internal system of thought which has no such property. Actually, sign language is less strictly linear because of the wider options available in visual space. The sensory motor systems that are used for externalization have nothing to do with language. They were in place long before language emerged. They have not changed since. True language is the internal system that generates thought, the I language, internal to an individual, coded as a recursive generative procedure in the brain that yields the basic property. So we now face the next question. Why does the infant reflexively ignore 100% of what it hears, linear order? And why does it attend only to what it never hears, abstract structures constructed by the mind? Actually, there's a straightforward answer. Satisfaction of the basic property requires a computational procedure. The simplest computational procedure is binary set formation. It's called merge in current work. And it's very easy to show that if recursive generation is based on merge, then structure dependence is automatically imposed and there's no linear order. There are many consequences. One simple consequence is that certain thoughts become inexpressible in speech, even very simple ones. So to illustrate for the very simple example. Let's shift from conjunction to disjunction. So take the sentence, either John or Mary is in the room. Either the girls or the boys are in the room. Works fine. How about either the girls or John are in the room? Neither is possible. The thought is very clear, and if number agreement were based on adjacency, could be easily expressed. But with structure dependence, the thought is inexpressible, except by elaborate paraphrase. This is incidentally one of many examples of conflict between optimal design and utility for communication. There are many others that are far more serious than this one. They're always resolved in the same way. Communicative efficiency is always sacrificed. To put it metaphorically, when Mother Nature was constructing language, she was concerned only with optimal design, didn't care how the system might be used. Turns out to be dysfunctional, so be it. It's worth noting that that's how evolution works quite generally. We can distinguish 3 steps in normal evolutionary change. The first is innovative. Some disruption takes place, maybe mutation, maybe a bacterium accidentally swallowing some other microorganism, which led to eukaryotic cells, the basis for complex life, by accident. The disruption introduces something new. Then comes the next stage, reconstruction. Nature redesigns the new system in the simplest way, satisfying natural law. These are matters discussed in depth in classic work of Darcy Thompson on laws of growth, and by Alan Turing on creation of patterns by physical law. I should say that that work was long ignored. It's now being recognized as fundamental. Well, the final stage of evolution is winnowing. Natural selection reduces the variety to the better adapted. Notice that there's some structural similarity here to the process of inquiry, as discussed by Jeffrey and Patrick. Well, the simplest solution produced at the second stage might turn out to be dysfunctional, but nature doesn't care. In reconstruction, nature seeks optimal design that has no way to consider possible functions. Language seems to fit the normal pattern. We can envision an evolutionary scenario that looks something like this. Some small rewiring of the brain yielded the general property of recursive generation. Nature then took the usual course of seeking the simplest such operation, relying on natural law, in this case, principles of computational efficiency. The result is a system based on merge, satisfying the basic property. Its deepest and most surprising property, structure dependence, follows at once with all of its ramified consequences. UG encodes the outcome. The infant, therefore, reflexively ignores everything it hears and attends only to the abstract structure its mind creates, fleshed out as thoughts. Well, in these terms, we can envision a resolution of the conundrum facing UG. The diversity condition we can put to the side in the study of the core system of generation of thought. The variety of languages is probably localized in very peripheral aspects of the lexicon and in externalization. Research seems to me to be tending in that direction, and it would be a natural outcome. The poverty of stimulus conditions on the core system are severe, sometimes very clearly insurmountable, as in the case of structure dependence. Furthermore, the amalgam of sensory motor systems and eye language poses a cognitive problem that can be solved in many ways. It would not be surprising to find that that's the locus of the complexity of language, the easy mutability of language from generation to generation, also the variety of languages, which will be superficial if these ideas are on the right track. I should perhaps mention that something rather similar has been found about the apparent variety of organisms, discoveries of the last 50 years. Well, if all of this is correct, then at least for eye language, the conundrum is largely reduced to satisfying the evolvability condition. The problem will be overcome to the extent that the structures of language are generated by the simplest operations. It's called the strong minimalist thesis, sets this outcome as a prime goal of the theory of language. Actually, these observations reinforce the traditional view that language is essentially a system of thought. The modern doctrine that language is basically a system of communication that may have evolved from animal communication seems quite untenable. Well, returning to the evolutionary scenario, the winnowing stage may never have been reached in the case of human language and thought, probably because the system is so tightly integrated that it's either all or none. That actually is increasingly what we find when we investigate more complex cases. Well, instead of going on to further cases of genuine explanation, let's turn to how thoughts are fleshed out. Eye language, recall, is a computational system. Any such system has primitive elements, kind of atoms of computation, and computational procedures to form new elements. For language, the primitive elements are the minimum meaning-bearing elements. In an analytic language like English, these are often words. So you have major books in the field with titles like Word and Object, W.V. Quine, or Words and Things, Roger Brown. For language generally, word is not the right concept. In fact, even for English, if we look closely, but let's keep to it for simplicity. Well, these titles reflect a standard view that words are linked to mind external objects by the relation of reference. Words refer to things in the world. For the sciences, establishing such a relation is a norm. When scientists speak of uranium or genes, they hope there are such things. It also seems that animal communication systems observe this condition with a one-to-one relation between the signals, say a monkey call and some physically identifiable event. But there's very good evidence that human language does not observe the referential doctrine. We use words to refer, which is an action, what John Austin called a speech act. But when we look closely at the meanings of words, there just isn't a word-object relation. So take a standard example in the philosophical literature, supposedly logical proper name like London. I can perfectly well say that I'm going to visit London next year after it was destroyed by fire and rebuilt 50 miles up the Thames with different materials and design. No one believes there's a real world entity with such hopelessly contradictory properties as these. Now, the fact is the word London is not a proper name. It's a city name. And our mental concept, city, has rich and complex properties, which are carried over when we use the word London in the speech act of referring. The observation generalizes to the entire vocabulary. Actually, the basic point was recognized by Aristotle. He was discussing the word house, and Aristotle observes that it's an amalgam of what he called matter and form. The material part is what a physicist could identify, the bricks, the timber, and so on. The form is a mental construction, the design, the intention of the architect, the characteristic use, and so on. So something could look exactly like where I live, but not be a house. Could be a library, could be a garage, could be a paperweight for a giant. Now, these are properties that aren't detectable by physical examination. Actually, even before Aristotle, a similar point was made by the pre-Socratic Heraclitus, who asked, how can we cross the same river twice, though its material component has entirely changed? Turns out to be a deep question. A little short thought shows that under radical material changes, it remains the same river, while under slight changes, barely detectable, it'll not be a river at all. Could be a canal, could even be a highway. That turns out to be true of even the simplest words that we use to refer. These features of language and thought raise new conundrums. All of this must be known without learning. In fact, it's correspondingly shared cross-linguistically in fundamental respects. Studies of language acquisition have shown that these items are acquired on very few presentations. That implies they're based on rich innate substructure. So learning is apparently a matter of settling relatively superficial properties. There's no analogs to such concepts in animal symbolic systems. There's no record of their development. For these reasons, the origin of human concepts has seemed to be a hopeless mystery, buried deep in the history, prehistory of Homo sapiens. But on reflection, that seems most unlikely. The rich and intricate concepts that are the atoms of communication, computation, these would have no function outside of a system of generation of thought that yields complex expressions that enter into reasoning, reflection, other mental acts. If they had, by some accident, emerged before language, they would have simply been discarded as useless waste. It's reasonable to suppose that when the capacity emerged for recursive generation of linguistic expressions, it appropriated elementary concepts that were available to proto-humans, and only later, as the combinatorial possibilities of generating language and thought became available, concepts of the distinctive human character appeared. How, we can only guess, but it might be possible to explore the question. Well, here actually the role of the strong minimalist thesis might appear. When some innovation appears, nature seeks the simplest way to accommodate it. The simpler the factors that do so, the more refined will be the system that is produced. If there are many factors intervening, the result is likely to be chaotic. So it's not much of a stretch of the imagination to think that the simplicity and discipline of the strong minimalist thesis had a significant role in the development of these unique conceptual resources of human thought. And as more is being learned about the rich, inventive, creative lives, complex social orders of the tens of thousands of years of human history that are now becoming accessible to inquiry, new and helpful insights into these questions might be coming into view. It's an exciting prospect. Following these paths, we might hope to get real insight into the nature of language and thought, fundamental features of the human capacity. Fundamental, but of course, not all inclusive. When we look around us, we see other striking features of this strange creature that recently appeared on Earth. One is actually illustrated dramatically in the business press right now. The oil cartel, OPEC, has just canceled its meeting because of its dispute between the two leading producers, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. They failed to agree on how much to increase fossil fuel production so as to profit from rising prices. Notice how much to increase fossil fuel production. That's one side of their brains, which seeks profit. The other side of their brains is telling them that increasing fossil fuel production will soon destroy everything they have, their palaces, their countries, any hope for a decent future for their children. To avoid these horrifying consequences, they must reduce production annually, reaching net zero by mid-century. The two sides of the brain don't communicate. The mental corpus callosum is severed. Same is true of the journalists who inform us of the proceedings, but don't trouble to mention that the producers are debating how quickly to destroy life on Earth. It's kind of as if journalists had covered the Nazi Wannsee conference in 1942, but kept to disputes about the best means to exterminate all Jews without raising any further questions. Well, unfortunately, that observation generalizes far more broadly. And the background is what's sometimes called an infodemic, a general assault on reason, fact, truth, knowledge. It's reminiscent of a chilling slogan of Franco's fascism in my childhood: death to intelligence, viva death. That call was frightening enough 85 years ago. Today, it's a call for species suicide. As we all know, this is far from the only case. Another, right in front of our eyes, is the monopolization of vaccines by the rich countries, in the full knowledge that this will not only kill vast numbers of poor people in Africa, Asia, Latin America, but it will also rebound to the rich as the virus mutates, new forms emerge that might be uncontrollable, of course, ignoring national boundaries. Another is the expenditure of huge sums on ways to destroy us all with new, more threatening weapons, funds that are desperately needed to combat destruction of the environment and major problems at home. Something similar took place 75 years ago. The world was in ruins, desperately needing repair. Huge expenditures were being devoted to creating still more awesome means to destroy everything. Surveying the scene, the great social critic Lewis Mumford wrote an essay with the title, "Gentlemen, You Are Mad." The words resonate. Unless we can overcome the infodemic, use our capacities to deliberate, to reason, the human experiment will come to an inglorious end. The moral is quite simple. There's a lot of work to do, and quickly.
Many thanks, Noam. I agree with all of that, of course. So we have a number of interesting questions from the audience, and I will begin to pose them. So one is, how is modern day technology, such as email, text, social media, how is that impacting the structure and quality of our thought and our language?
It's a pretty hard question to answer because it's very hard to gain solid data. But there is some evidence that the availability of social media, texting, obsession with the internet has had a notable effect on literacy. Literacy seems to be declining. If you look at, there are probably many factors on this, so these may be only some of them. But if you look at school curricula, for example, in the United States, novels that used to be assigned in middle school are now being assigned in high school. Students who come to the university have no experience trying to write an essay other than following some fixed form that's told, start this way, then do that, and so on. Actually, I see it in my own teaching of freshmen at State University, University of Arizona. How much this is due to social media obsession and texting, we don't know, but it's probably committed to it. It does lead to a kind of vulgarization, oversimplification. It's pretty well established that the social media tend to drive people into self-reinforcing bubbles, but where they never hear anything except their own views, repeated even more loudly. It's led to a lack of deliberation and communication among all of us. At the same time, has positive aspects. It enables people who were previously silent to express their views. It does make it possible to find out about the thinking cultures of other societies. Much more easy. It's a lot more easy to tap your finger on the keyboard than to go downtown and look at the public library. So that's an advantage. But that advantage, unfortunately, is not used very much. It's a shame. On the whole, personally, I just keep away from social media altogether. I don't want to touch them, but I think it's generally had a cheapening effect.
Very good. So the next question is, given that we are experiencing an economic and racial reckoning, how can we expand the lesson of knowing thyself to knowing others?
Well, that's a battle that's being fought right now, right in the mainstream. A dramatic illustration of it is the legislation being passed in many states with Republican governors and legislatures banning discussion of these issues. The frame is banning what they call critical race theory. None of them have the slightest idea what it is, but it mentions race, so it must be bad. So we have to mimic old-fashioned Stalinism by laws that ban discussion of issues that are absolutely central to our existence. After all, we've lived through 400 years of miserable, vicious white supremacy, leaving a terrible legacy that still exists. You look at just recently, there were a study of mortality statistics in Chicago. Racially, it's very different and increasing. The difference is increasing. It's traceable back to racist laws that banned blacks coming from the South to move into white neighborhoods. These were actually federal laws till the late 1960s. One of many examples that leaves a horrifying legacy. But we're not supposed to talk about it. We're supposed to repeat patriotic messages. That's the law in Oklahoma, Texas, Iowa, other states. So let's move on to full-fledged Stalinism. It's a very live issue.
Indeed. The next question. Why could it not be the case that humans are deep learning systems that learn from big data? Why do we need to put forward the idea of innate language abilities?
Well, one reason is that these systems don't do anything. Actually, I kind of hinted at that obliquely in what I said when I was pointing out that we want universal grammar to be an explanation of how humans acquire actual systems of language and thought, but reject and don't learn impossible systems of language and thought. That's called science. We want to understand the way the world works. Take, say, BERT, or one of the deep learning systems. If it's applied to huge amounts of data of human language, say the Wall Street Journal corpus, it'll find regularities and patterns which mislead newspaper journalists into saying it's learning something. If the same techniques are applied to what's total garbage for humans, we'll get the same results. Even better results if it uses systems that involve linear order, which are much simpler computations. So in other words, it's telling us nothing. It's telling us that whatever I look at, I find some patterns. Okay, it's like kind of as if somebody went into a quantum theory conference and said, I got a great answer. You can throw out all you're doing. Anything goes. That'll include the right answer, whatever it is. Of course, it'll include everything else, but anything goes. So you guys can all close your books and hang up. I think it's approximately what it is. Jeffrey may want to say something more.
I concur, but this is your show. In the language domain still. So there was recent news that Neanderthals make art. Did they have language?
For several reasons, the question's unanswerable. First reason is we have to define what we mean by language. Do we mean human language, distinctive organic property, or do we mean anything that loosely falls under the range of activity that has some meaning for us, like the language of the stars or the language of bees or whatever. If it's the latter, there's nothing to say. Science can only proceed by looking at reasonably well-defined concepts. There is an entity in the natural world, language and linguistically constructed thought. We can study that. So in the case of Neanderthals, the first thing we'd have to ask is, do we mean that, or do we mean any old thing? There are actually articles coming out now in Proceedings of the Society of the National Academy, studying how bacteria, which have no cognitive capacities, can combine two signals and interpret them differently than if there's a single signal. These are chemical signals, and seriously debating whether this could have something to do with evolution of language. This is what evolutionary biologists ridicule as just so stories. So that's the first question. Second question, we just have no records. Nobody knows. I mean, there is evidence of apparent symbolic activity by Neanderthals, but all of the known records are well after the appearance of Homo sapiens. And we just don't know. There are Neanderthal, aside from Africa, we all have Neanderthal genes. The human species started in Africa 60, 70,000 years ago, maybe more. People started leaving. Homo sapiens started leaving. They interbred with Neanderthal, maybe even with Denisovan, we don't know. So there's a small number of Neanderthal genes. So the two groups interacted. We don't know how much, and you don't know how to interpret the few examples there are. There are some claims about symbolic activity, maybe 300,000 years ago, but when you look, they're pretty skimpy. I mean, remember, all of the paleoanthropological evidence is pretty scattered. There's many complex aesthetic achievements of humans that leave no record at all, like sand painting. It can be very complex. You see it if you watch children, but the next wave that comes in and it's gone. Humans in the last roughly 30,000 years, which we are now becoming able to study, lived pretty complex lives and had complex cultural achievements. Some of them are barely preserved in the archaeological record. Most have just disappeared. Go back 200,000 years, it's pretty skimpy.
And a plug for, Noam and I and a group of evolutionary biologists wrote a paper some years ago entitled The Mystery of Language Evolution. So if anyone's interested, Google that for more information. Here's perhaps a final question. I think we're approaching our deadline. Given your analysis in Requiem for the American Dream, a book documentary, what has to occur for young people in this country to have any hope for a better future? How do we use our unique human capacities for a better future?
That's the most important question we can ask. And the answer to it is pretty straightforward. For every one of the crises that we face, including those I mentioned, environmental destruction, nuclear war, pandemic, infodemic, for every one of them, we have solutions. The solutions are feasible, they're within reach, they're spelled out in some detail, We know what to do. Question is, do we have the will to do it? Can we put that mental corpus callosum back together? Can we do what the leaders of OPEC failed to do, failed to recognize that their search for profit tomorrow was going to destroy everything they have and all their lives? Can we put that together, overcome that deep flaw, use our intellectual capacities, which are extraordinary, and take the solutions that we know are possible and work to implement them? And things are being done in that direction. So take, say, environmental destruction. There is now a resolution in Congress for the first time, introduced by Representative Ocasio-Cortez, came in on the Sanders wave, Senator Ed Markey, a senior senator from Massachusetts, been interested in environmental his life. There's a resolution spelling out in clear, precise detail exactly what we must do and can do to overcome the threat of environmental destruction. Well, it got that far because of intense activism by mostly young people. And it can get farther to legislation by the same means. And it can get farther to implementation, again, same means. Same is true on every other issue. We can get vaccines to all the world. We can end the development and even the possession of nuclear weapons. We have ways to contain the environmental crisis and move on to a better life. Some are pursuing it. Some are insisting on keeping the two sides of the brain separate. That's the problem we have to overcome. And it's in the hands of the questioner and others like them.
I think final 1 minute short question, then I'll return it to Pat. So recently at Congress, the Navy disclosed the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena. So UFOs, Noam, what do we think? Have we been visited by extraterrestrial intelligence?
Now, I'll give you a non-serious answer, which has serious import. A non-serious answer was that those UFOs are extraterrestrial creatures of very high intelligence who are quickly flying past to take a look at Earth and are so appalled by what they're seeing that they want to get out of here very fast and have nothing to do with these lunatics. Well, I don't believe that. So it's a fanciful answer, but the import is significant. Lewis Mumford's words, "Gentlemen, you are mad. You don't have to be."
Indeed. Very good. So I shall return this to Pat. Many thanks.
Thank you, Noam. And we really, really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts and ideas. A lot of interesting thoughts, but I just wanted to comment, you're an optimist. And I'm impressed with your optimism because there's so much challenge in the world, but as you know, these challenges are really opportunities in disguise, and we can do better. And I think you've laid out some interesting theories that, you know, we've been exposed to this for a while as we've been trying to work through this concept of a new kind of AI, human-style AI, based on Noam's earlier work. And I'm an optimist too. So with that said, thank you so much. And again, thank you everybody for joining. And, you know, I hope to see you in the future. Stay healthy. and take care. Aloha, and stay safe. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.